The book, Mao's Great Famine, is about what happened in China from 1958 to 1962. It seems like a very short period of time to study, but you have to bear in mind that literally tens of millions of people died entirely unnecessarily as a result of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. What was that? It was an attempt to really jump, if you wish, from socialism into communism. And the way Mao wanted to do it is to put every villager into a people's commune and radically collectivize everybody. Just consider people like foot soldiers in a giant army that could be deployed to tackle water conservancy projects during the slack winter months and plow the fields during the spring and produce steel and backyard furnaces during the summer. And that resulted in extraordinary rates of death. And not just that, but one result of collectivization, when you take away a man's land, when you take away his grain, his tools, his utensils, his work schedule, when you start bossing him about and even confiscate his home. One result is that by removing every incentive to work, you no longer leave this man with any incentive. You take away the carrot, you need the stick to beat him and force him to go back into the fields. So it's not just people who died of famine, but they also died of violence. People had urine poured over them for not working hard enough. They were beaten, they were pummeled, they were tied up and thrown into ponds for falling asleep. For stealing a handful of grain, some people had their ears chopped off. A few were buried alive. Extraordinary levels of violence that went hand in hand with radical collectivization. And that really is what the book is about. Exactly. Or more precisely, like a giant army. And he said it very clearly in the summer of 1958. In Chinese, the saying is, 全民皆兵. It means every man, every woman, a soldier. So the model was the military. He wanted to have people deployed into platoons, brigades, and house them in barracks, separate out the man from the women, send children to boarding school, have toddlers taken care of in kindergartens, and use people like they're just soldiers who execute your orders. So the whole country is really run like a massive barracks. That's what it is. The problem is you can do it with soldiers, but you can't do it with ordinary people. As I said earlier on, once you kill any incentive to work, you take away the profit motive. All you have left is raw coercion to get them to do the things that you want them to do. It didn't work at all. It led to chaos. The transportation system creaked to a halt and then collapsed altogether. Housing was destroyed. There was an attack sustained on nature. In some parts of the country, up to 50% of the forest coverage was lost as people go around cutting down trees to feed these backyard furnaces. People die. Entire villages are more or less extinguished. So it's a catastrophe at every level. But of course, people themselves, they fight back. They want to survive, often at any cost. They will do anything to somehow try to get through this famine. So they start stealing first from the state, then they start stealing from each other. It's chaos. Sometimes people point, when you go to a village in China, and you ask them about the Great Leap Forward, they'll say, oh, well, one thing worked well, you know, that's that little reservoir that we built over there. But even that is not really true. In most cases, all these water conservancy projects, dams, canals, dikes, reservoirs, built at enormous human and economic cost, were rendered useless because they were very poorly designed and very poorly built. And in many cases, they had adverse effects. They led to landslides, to river silting, to soil salinization and devastating inundations. So even that aspect turned out to be much more negative than anything else. One of the most amazing aspects of China during this period, and in fact of the entire Maoist period, is the ability to somehow project an image of success when there is absolute dire catastrophe on the ground. So even as this great leap forward is claiming the lives of millions of people, there are enough people abroad to read whatever magazines are produced by Beijing and think that this is actually working rather well. You have somebody like François Mitterrand, who will be president of France, who visits Mao Zedong in 1960 and comes back to proclaim to the world that there's no such thing as famine in China and everything is wonderful. There might be a few shortages. So there's never been a lack of people who buy into this myth, and never underestimate the amount of resources at the time that were poured into building up this image of success. And I find that contrast between the projected image and the reality on the ground, find that contrast obscene. By the end of 1961, there is the extent of social collapse, transportation system in a mess, housing being destroyed, people starving everywhere. The extent of this catastrophe is such that Mao no longer has any alternative but to just step back and allow that economy to somehow gradually recover. So oddly enough, he steps back and he allows what he detests most, namely the profit motive, to reappear. Farmers are allowed to cultivate a little plot. They're allowed to somehow go to market and sell their produce. So from the end of 1961, somehow very slowly, the country climbs out of that massive black hole that it has just dug for itself. It takes very long. Of course, one issue is that those inside China who write tend to be in the cities, and the cities have been sheltered from the countryside. The grain is taken from farmers to feed the cities. The real first sign that something was wrong is in the middle of the 1980s, when the People's Republic publishes its official statistical yearbooks, and a number of demographers discover a huge discrepancy in the number of people who are born, the number of people who die from 1958 to 62. So on the basis of those statistics, a number of demographers start looking at what might have happened during that period. But it's only very recently, with the archives opening up, that we've come to realize the full extent of what happened during those years. Well, as a historian, I rely on archives, and I spent about 4 years going from archive to archive, several dozen of them, and in total probably 6 months, in a whole series of trips, which are very easy to carry out from Hong Kong. It's ultimately just next door. You can take a train in your Guangdong province. Sometimes I got very lucky. On occasion, I was told in a very polite way that there was nothing there for me. But with persistence, as a historian, I just discovered mountains of material, letters written by ordinary people and sent to the leadership, reports about children who were abandoned and verbatim interviews with them, reports from the Public Security Bureau, minutes from very important meetings held by Mao and the other leaders in Beijing, just a wealth of material there. Although, of course, a lot of it remains to this day very carefully locked away. It's surprising at first, but when you think about it, every one-party state is obsessed about information. In particular, the one-party state under Stalin and under Mao, they want to have information about everything and everybody. They want to know everybody's business. There's a huge sprawling bureaucracy to keep these files. So that's not entirely surprising. And then, of course, one-party states purge themselves all the time. They're always seeking out people who did things wrong. People who are too much on the left, too much on the right, too much here, too much there. So that also produces a lot of written evidence. And then I think the other important point is to explain that it would be very difficult for anybody in any position of power to go into the archives and take material out. It's difficult simply because a lot of the evidence exists in multiple copies. It's sent out to very different people and very different organizations. And secondly, it's difficult because it would look very suspect. And if you do that, you might well be the next one who will be purged. So there's a mountain of material. But of course, it's a difficult question for me because I work as a historian and I don't work on China today, and it's a different world altogether. I really stopped with the death of the good old chairman Mao in 1976. But it seems to me that it might be wise to look at some of these signs of progress with at least a little bit of, you know, a sense of unease. Already during the Great Leap Forward, there was this extraordinary contrast between the public buildings that went up. Beijing was spruced up in 1959 for the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic, and the reality of starvation in the countryside. Now, China today is enormously different. There's no such thing as a famine on the scale that happened during those years. But there is a deep contrast between what you see, mainly in cities with brand new airports, and what you find in the countryside. Often it is enough to take a car and drive out of the city, and your 4-lane highway becomes a 2-lane highway, and then very quickly becomes a little rutted road going nowhere. And I think it's that contrast that we really have to bear in mind. Not everything is as it seems.